And we now invite Professor Asha Sarangi, who teaches political science in Center for Political Studies, JNU. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the organizing committee, in particular Dr. Chanchal Kumar Sharma, Elizabeth Ever, and Wilfred. Thanks to Hans Seidel Foundation as well for inviting me and sharing my thoughts on this subject. I think a great administrator that Mr. Chopra is, but he's a great communicator. And the first test of a great administrator is to be a great communicator. And you have both of them in you so well. I think yesterday, Mr. Chopra said that we should go back to Hind Swaraj. And I totally agree with him because Hind Swaraj is much more relevant for us now, not because of what Gandhi wrote, but how I think the idea of the nation and state have also changed in our time. So it's a text, it's a civilizational text which can be read over and over again. And I think the more we read, the more nuances we get. So I totally agree with you from yesterday, point that you make. Today's newspaper, if some of you have read, must have seen that there is an agitation over a border area between Maharashtra and Karnataka. It takes me back to what Mr. Sanjeev Chopra was talking about, the mapping of lands and terrains. Belgaum, which is now being called Belgavi, is fighting over two languages, Kannada and Marathi. So Marathi speakers have been laying claim to this area of Belgaum since the beginning, and it could not be resolved even way back in 1956. So some of the issues that we have been talking about, federalism in times of crisis, actually have gone back to more than 50 years, and that's where I want to talk about and talk a little bit about the historical context, because much we have talked about the contemporary crisis in federalism in terms of the arrangement and sharing of power between the center and state and subunits. But what about the whole idea of federalism as a constitutional arrangement or something more than that? Why is it the kind of federalism we have because of certain historical context? So that's where I want to come in. I really don't have many anecdotes to share like Mr. Chopra, but so what I would do, I have written something, and to save time and to be more coherent, I'll just read parts of my presentation that I have written. So I would like to start by saying that crises of various kinds at different points of time in the life and times of India over the last 7.5 decades since independence have also reflected the conflicts, cooperation, and their continuity into the state and federal structure of the country. It is therefore important to look at the historical context of the first decade to understand as to why Indian federalism has been termed variously, like quasi-federalism, federalism with unitary bias, Austin's words, or Stephen Alfred calling it federalism, which holds together, but doesn't come together, or India described as indestructible union of destructible states. In fact, Rudolphs have characterized the two phases of federalism called old and new federalism. It has to do, I think, this kind of variation in the characterization of federalism has to do over periodic changes that have come into the unfolding of federalism as a structure and practice. But let me also talk a little bit about the diversity of this country, which actually has to be taken note of. And I can be corrected because we have two administrators here who have worked on the ground level. But just to give you a very, very brief, and that too again through the mapping or through the census records, we have about 3,000 castes. We have about 25,000 subcastes. We have about 1,600 plus, 1,632 is the old figure of 1961 census, which gives us the mother tongue figure. We have about 700 languages, and 22 official languages, not to talk about many other speech varieties or languages spoken by less than 10,000 people, which does not get enumerated in the census. We have about 766 districts. I'm not talking about sub-districts, subdivisions, or even sub-units, and about 664,369 figure. How do you, villages. So 6 lakhs, more than 6 lakhs villages, and many other ways in which the geographical units have been understood, so much going down to the village, sub-village, Mahila Mandal Dal, and so on and so forth. So I think the practitioners of the government, like Mr. Chopra and Mr. Mahesh, who have worked with people, can actually tell us how much is the diversity, how complex and how dense this is. So it's also sometimes a myth to talk about the standardization of this diversity, because no amount of standardization and uniformization can actually explain the diversity, the complexity, and the decentralization of all kinds that happens in this society. So the form of Indian federalism, emerging out of the constitutional debates, deliberations, and democratic imagination on the floor of the Constituent Assembly during the period of 1946 to 49, is a reminder of the fact that Indian federalism is often termed as holding together rather than coming together, unlike the US federalism. This holding togetherness of Indian federalism was forced during the first decade of independent India through institutional innovations and endurance of the deep democratic imaginaries during the anti-colonial struggle of Indian nationalism. This was much more evident in the idea of linguistic and territorial federalism, which began to emerge during this period from 1920 onwards. The question of regional autonomy, subnational or sub-state devolution of power and resources, sovereignty of states within the Union, coordination between consolidation and differentiation of power within the federal design of the Constitution began to appear in a variety of policies, programs, institutions, discourses, and politics of the day. The political innovations and state initiatives of various kinds, which we have been talking about over the last 1.5 days, of various kinds to strengthen democratic consolidation in the times of crisis, and there have been crises even earlier than the pandemic, emerging out of partition, as Mr. Chopra was also talking about it yesterday, and the creation of 2 independent nation states were to be tested and tried in the years to come. The early years of federal design, I would argue, and its constituent units needed to address issues of development within the liberal democratic framework, concerns for poverty amelioration, inter and intra-state regional imbalances of sustainable natural resources, disparity of institutional infrastructure in health, education, medical sectors primarily, but also in many other sectors, issues of socio-cultural diversity and political leadership, among others, in the states of Indian Union. Despite these early challenges, Indian state continued to experiment and establish new institutions of various kinds to usher in robust forms of federal polity soon after independence. And I think we need to remember this, that how institutions were set up. And it's a very interesting way to look at institutions, not simply because they were set up randomly, but there was a certain design behind that. There was certain sequential logic as to why certain institutions were set up at certain point of time. So there is a historical institutionalism that we need to look at. For almost a decade and a half, with Congress as a single dominant party ruling the country till 1967, the relationship between the Union and the states was rather less strenuous and moved on the idea of a workable partnership. Now, some of us have read Harrison, who called India's first decade as the dangerous decades, which I want to actually call them as demanding and commanding decades, not really the dangerous decades, because it was said that India was about to break again, and it was going to go for the second partition. With the creation of the 14 new states, which happened after the reorganization, and integration of 560 plus princely states after independence, India began a journey of state formation on a new scale and size. Each of these states was linguistically defined with their boundaries and borders well mapped out. In Nehruvian scheme of social welfareism, the territorial demarcation and redemarcation of these large states would bring in more equitable distribution of resources and an amicable flow of capital and labor between developed and underdeveloped regions and states of these regions of these states. That was Nehruvian way of actually accepting the reorganization, because Nehru always favored larger states, and he said where the relationship is bad between two parts or two major regions of the state, there should be an amicable divorce, separation rather than a bitter divorce. So he went in and he accepted the reorganization, even though initially he was reluctant, because he thought it will have some kind of a flow of labor and capital mutually agreed upon between the developed part of the state and underdeveloped part of the state. The idea of equitable economic growth of different regions and states of India, coupled with some vision of social justice and empowerment of the marginalized sections of the society, began to be aspired for by the Indian state. However, the vested interests of the power elite and its class, caste, and regional consolidation, it's very interesting how each of these states began to show the linkages between class, caste, and regional domination and consolidation, one entrenched in the institutional architecture of the state. And I think we should be careful when we read the history or political history of India after independence as to how this kind of consolidation emerged in the reorganized states. A number of institutions in the realm of economy, like Planning Commission, Interstate Council, NDC, education commissions, committees of various kinds, language commissions, cultural institutions, election commission, public service commission, a large number of new universities and colleges of both natural and social sciences, among others, were set up to pursue the objectives of state-led economic and political development. In fact, after the reorganization, when the riots happened in some parts of India, particularly in southern part, in the state of Tamil Nadu, Nehru was so perturbed that he decided to set up something called Emotional Integration Committee, because he was really taken aback that language can become such a divisive issue. And this is very interesting. That report only, oh really? Am I done? I haven't. I don't know where.
1-2 minutes more.
Oh, goodness. Well, all right. So what I'm saying is that what Maya Tudor has also called that India presents a case of democratic exceptionalism of some kind. Maybe if I really don't have time to go into the history of political history of India since 1956, let me just end with few conceptual issues that I think I would like to share with you, and maybe we can then talk about it in the Q&A answers. Right. I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes, not more than that. Okay, it's important, as we were listening earlier, to the mapping of India as it has happened over the years. It is also important to know how states, which were categorized as A, B, C, D, were actually reorganized, and this kind of distinction was taken away, and states were brought onto some kind of a uniform scale. But the internal diversity, internal regional disparity did not go away, and I think that has also affected the federal structure of the states and the union. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Second thing, I think, as we say that in case of modernity, feudalism has also left behind its vestiges. Similarly, I would say in case of newer states that were formed, the princely states or the provincial states or the states which were under different categories continued to have some of their, sort of vestiges behind. So what I'm trying to say is the political rationality did not really work in the manner in which we probably tend to think. The kind of asymmetry that brings me to this issue of geography, history, culture, and ideology resulted in economic, political, and administrative asymmetries largely. So idea of intergovernmental relations due to differences of size, capacity, and resources needs to be kept in mind. We need to understand the relationship between federalism and nationalism, more so in our time when we are talking about one nation and one. I really don't want to talk about it. But nationalism, or the idea of nation-state, nation, has become very, very important. Somehow we are living in these times of hyper-nationalism, where federalism then becomes a necessary precondition for the protection of diversities of the country, whether they be linguistic, cultural, ethnic, and so on and so forth. And the case of Indian federalism suggests that it is not the suppression, but recognition of these diversities which was the norm for Indian democracy and federalism. Last but not the least, I will end. I think there are three ways in which I would have talked about it. The sort of Indian federalism. One is through the set of discourses, whether discourses in terms of welfareism or Nehruvian paradigm of development. Another is in terms of institutions. Why certain institutions were set up? Was there a certain kind of sequential logic? And third, which is about the politics, because politics does matter. So I think if we are talking about institutions and discourses, we also need to bring in the kind of politics which has been internal to the setting up of certain discourses and institutions. And that's where maybe I can just end with a couple of questions and with Tocquevillian idea of democratic society. The relevant question that we can ask is how India's journey of democratic transitions and transformation over the last 7.5 decades still presents a paradox or puzzle about democratic imagination of a certain kind. How a state can shift its political terrain from democratic accommodation, and I mean it, from democratic accommodation, if you look at the early decades of 50s, 60s until the 70s, to an authoritarian summation of social and hence the resolution through the new normal or new political that we are witnessing in our own times, not just in India, but in several other parts of the world. I'll end here, but if I get a time, I hope you let me explain.